In case you didn't know, October is Filipino American History Month. So for today, Connections to Alaska, I had just planned Filipinos in the Star of Scotland on the right there. And but the relevance and timing of Filipinos in the Burnside, the ship on the left, compelled me to do both. So that explains my title change up at the top there. So the first 10 minutes will be Alaska's Filipino cable workers on the Burnside, and the second 10 minutes, Alaska's Filipino cannery workers on the Star of Scotland. Are you ready? Please hold your questions for the Q&A. Slide, please. The Burnside, formerly the Rita, was a Spanish freighter the U.S. captured off Puerto Rico in the Spanish-American War, 1898. The next month, our U.S. Army refitted her as a transport ship in the Atlantic. 2 years later, 1900, she was assigned to the U.S. Army Transport Service and refitted for cable work in the Philippines. There, Filipinos were hired as cable crew. As a result, they gained unique and invaluable cable laying expertise. Their most famous job started June 1903. The Burnside and her Filipino crew left for Sitka via Seattle. Then they were assigned to the U.S. Army Signal Corps and arrived Seattle by August. Thelma Buckholt in Filipinos in Alaska validated this. She wrote, in 1903, about 80 Filipinos formed a crew to lay underwater cables connecting southeastern Alaska with Seattle. The purpose of the cable was to provide Alaska's U.S. military communication to Seattle and the lower 48. It also eliminated reliance on the Canadian system. Next, I'll show the connection of the Burnside to another ship. Slide, please. By 1901, the U.S. Army Transport Service was making regular round trips between Manila and Seattle. This image shows one of them in Seattle, the U.S. Army Transport Dix, and Kayla, if you'll point to that. In addition to transporting troops, the Dix also carried Filipino cable workers and crew headed for the Burnside or their return to Manila. In that way, Seattle became the transfer point for Burnside cable workers either direction, Alaska or Manila. In 1908, my father was a 14-year-old runaway and deck boy on that Dix. So he spent time with those Filipino cable workers whether they were headed for the Burnside or Manila. And I can show more evidence of the Dix's connection to the Burnside. Slide, please. This is a page from the 1908 Dix log. I should say a Dix log. They had multiple trips that year. It clearly shows Filipino crew down at the bottom being transported in steerage note from the Burnside to the Dix in Seattle and returning to Manila. Next, actual Burnside Filipinos. Slide, please. On the Burnside, Filipino cable workers and some of the crew, all Filipinos. All the officers on the ship were Americans. So you may be wondering how they communicated. Well, the Filipinos made it simple. They spoke English, Spanish, and Tagalog. Most of them were only in their 20s or 30s. For the actual cable laying, I want you to imagine this. The workers sat in a chair, which was lowered over the side of the ship. As it descended to the rough waters, the chair would bang against the ship. Despite this, the confident Filipinos refused safety belts and often special warm clothing. The conditions were very dangerous. Severe cold, icebergs, heavy seas, even the possibility of drowning. Then I want to add a personal oral history on Filipinos adapting to cold. In 1985, I spent 2.5 years in the Philippines as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I witnessed their reaction to cold. A few times I rode the bus from Bicol to Manila, I noted that as soon as the driver turned on the AC, Filipinos donned heavy winter coats, hats, and mittens for the 12-hour ride. They had no tolerance for the cold. So somehow, these cable workers, despite coming from the tropics, adapted and performed in frigid conditions. Next, their gift to Alaska. Slide, please. This map is primary data, so that's the good news. And Kayla, if you'll help with the pointer here. The bad news is the critical cities are not very legible, so I'll identify them first. Seattle down at the bottom, right? Sitka, Valdez, and Seward is not identified at all, but it is only 193 cable miles from Valdez, or Valdez, as I think is another pronunciation. So I'm using Valdez as reference for both. So the work occurred over 3 years, 1903, 1904, and 1908. The Filipinos completed the first line, Sitka to Valdez, October 2, 1903. Then because they were finishing up, as Alaska's winter was approaching, the Burnside returned to Manila for cable work there. And then she returned to Alaska again the following year. So then, August 28, 1904, they completed the second line. And if you'll point this out, Kelly, Sitka to Seattle. This was the most dangerous of the 3 lines because of the ice and storms. Then the following year, August 3, 1905, they completed Valdez to Seward, the southeastern terminus of the Alaskan Railway. However, as is usually the case, tweaks and repairs were needed, and the Filipinos also gained initial work along the U.S. West Coast. The 1908 ship log that I showed earlier indicates that continued activity. So next we shift gears to Alaska's connection to 1915 Filipinos on a different ship and different work, but I will reference the cable workers again there. Slide, please. In 1915, the Star of Scotland was one of the last square riggers around. The Alaska Packers Association, APA, used them to transport cannery workers to Larsen Bay simply because it was cheaper than using and maintaining steamships. In San Francisco, Chinese subcontractors had the market on hiring and paying the fish gangs. That arrangement eliminated record keeping and payment for APA. APA, like the sugar planters in Hawaii, also wanted cheap labor. Pat Rappel, I'm sure some of you knew her, in Salmon from Kodiak, told us for the 1915 season, 220 cannery workers were on that ship. 80 whites, 100 Filipinos, and 40 other. Those 100 Filipinos were replacing the Chinese and Japanese who were no longer available after the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Japanese Gentleman's Agreement. So on April 7th, Star of Scotland left San Francisco and arrived in Larsen Bay April 30, 24 days later. No manifest has survived, but other evidence shows my father was on that ship as well as on the decks in 1908. This time he was no longer 14. He had just turned 21. He was one of the Filipino fish gang. In Larsen Bay, Filipinos named themselves alascaros, cannery workers, in the same way that Filipinos in Hawaii had named themselves cicadas. Then Larsen Bay. Slide, please. This is the 2015 renovated Larsen Bay Cannery. But in 1915, living conditions were harsh. Sue Ellen Liljeblad, in The Man Who Packed the Harvest, told us the 1915 Filipinos bunked in the inferior buildings named Chinatown. Chinatown was furthest from the cannery, near the hog pens, with the related odors. My father would have had a very small room, roughly finished, and only one window. Downstairs, a small stove was his only heat source. At night, the frigid wind slipped through the cracks, making sleep miserable. But September 22, at Season's End in San Francisco, they delivered 58,790 cases of salmon for worldwide distribution. Some of that salmon fed soldiers on the Western Front in World War I. The highlight of that 1915 cannery season was an annual tradition. Larsen Bay showed her wish for statehood with an annual July 4 celebration. Joe Nichols was the cannery supervisor, and his daughter took 23 pictures. That collection resides in the University of Alaska Fairbanks Library. And what a party. Slide, please. July 4, 1915. Work stopped for the day. And the Filipinos were in charge of the party. They had a parade, floats, acrobats, jugglers, music, dancing, fireworks, and dinner. And Kayla, if you'll point to my father, that's him in drag with his hand on his hip. He's in 7 of the Nichols 23 pictures. And then Kayla, if you'll point to the men in the suits, I want you to note Filipinos in suits, and I'll say more about them later. And then another note, despite giving the Filipinos all the responsibility for the party, they minimized them with a title. And Kayla, if you'll point up to the top, the Filipino boys. Today, 99 of those 100 Filipinos remain anonymous, except one, my father. And here, I want to go back to the Filipino cable workers. They too may have been forgotten. We know from the Dix log I showed earlier, some returned to Manila when their contracts expired. However, because they were nationals and no longer aliens, they had unrestricted travel. So my guess is Some, or possibly many, did not return to Manila. I am hoping someone will do that research. Okay, back to the Alascaros. July 5, 1915, they returned to the hazardous cannery work. But that 1915 season was not the end of my research. In 2015, Kismet. Paul and I jumped at the invitation to Larsen Bay's July 4 celebration, my father's centennial. We toured the cannery, did mug up, ate in the dining hall, slept in the new bunkhouse, and enjoyed all the July 4 festivities, even pie eating. We spoke with that year's Alascaros, and they loved hearing stories about my father. It was wonderful. Then canneries about 25 years later. Slide, please. In Seattle, 1939, and other West Coast ports, Filipinos were still shipping north for cannery season. Note the suits again. This time, they were not duped in their contract to purchase them. Filipinos are clothes horses. Of course, in 1915, they never needed suits. They were told there would be important meetings. Some of these 1939 Alascaros were college students earning tuition money for the fall. Some were old-timers, and you'll see some older faces there, making seasonal work a career. But the slime line and retort work were mostly the same. The Larsen Bay Cannery remains operational today. Filipinos still travel north to work the old-fashioned way. Then Seattle, Alaska's changes in the cannery business today. Slide, please. A new model of commercial fishing has arrived in Kodiak and other West Coast port towns. And Kayla, if you'll point to the trawler there. These monster trawlers harvest, process, and freeze their product at sea. One of the 2015 Filipinos we met in Larsen Bay told us he worked on a trawler when he was not working at the cannery. So a takeaway for Connections to Alaska, I think you will agree, the Burnside Filipino cable workers literally connected Alaska, the lower 48, and the world. And Filipino cannery workers on the Star of Scotland connected Alaska's salmon to the world. And lest we forget, my father on the Dix and the Star of Scotland connected both. They all facilitated Alaska's international crossroads. If you're interested in progress and publication of my father's story, please follow me on Facebook. And slide, please. From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank Alaska Historical Society, Rachel Mason, Paul Lewis, my husband, Cynthia Wentworth, Russell Vanderloot, and you, the audience. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.
Couple of questions. In the back there?
So I haven't personally been to Barrow, but my family has a few times and have noticed many Filipinos in Barrow working at the post offices in different locations. Would they be connected to possibly some of this migration?
It's certainly possible. You would have to check with them to ask about their family. But the reality is, Filipinos are very anxious to travel and to find jobs anywhere in the world. I mean, my husband and I have traveled to all 7 continents, and we have found Filipinos everywhere. So they're in Saudi, they're in Europe, they're in South America, they're in Africa, they're just everywhere. So, and while we've been to Alaska 2 or 3 times now, and everywhere we went, we met Filipinos. So it's very possible, yes.
Other questions? Great, well, thank you so much, Diana.
Oh, you're
I-
welcome. Thank
Oh, we
you.
got one more, we got one more.
Would this be connected to the Filipinos, perhaps in Dutch Harbor and Unalaska as well? It's technically not that far from Larsen Bay.
I would say yes, because I've met, we live in Seattle now, and I've met a lot of Filipinos here who worked at the canneries, different ones from my father. And whenever we've been in Alaska, we've met Filipinos who worked at canneries, even on the plane coming back and forth. There were always Filipinos. And, you know, when they talk to me, they say, oh, well, we worked in the cannery, we worked in such and such a cannery, you know. So, yeah, I mean, they're very, very open to travel. Remember, they're from an island. And if they want to go anywhere, they have to travel. So, and they do, they go anywhere.
All right, well, thank you so
Oh,
much.
Rachel?
You're welcome. Thank you.
More.
Just, you're talking about the Larsen Bay Cannery reminded me, when I spoke to elders, indigenous elders, Alutiiks in Chignix, they remembered the Chinatown barracks. And they said that people actually slept on rice bags. Those were their bags. Yeah, so it was brutal and yeah.
I would not be surprised. I mean, I took my information from Sue Ellen Liljeblad, but in speaking to some of the people we met when we were at Larsen Bay, they said the conditions were really sad. And, you know, it's like so much in life. When you go to the place, you have a better feel for what could have happened. I mean, I can still remember Paul and I walking through the cannery, and you could see etchings on the wall and on the ceilings of people who wanted to leave their mark. It was just so amazing to us how, and some of it was positive, you know, they were happy, and some of it was really pitiful. You could see how sad they were. It just really broke your heart to read these things etched into the wall or ceiling that, and some of them were dated. And then, oh, they also had a graveyard there because some people died. So when you go to a cannery, it's a different experience, and I hope you get that opportunity someday, because if in some ways for me it was a highlight of my life, because my father never told me about this experience at a cannery, and to actually go there, I got to see what it must have been like for him. And it really saddened me. But at the same time, what I learned from it is my father was a real fighter. Nothing, he wouldn't stop at nothing, no matter how bad things were. He would just go on to plan B and forget about what happened before. I mean, he had been a cicada in Hawaii before this. Not immediately before, but before that. And as I've studied his life and so many of the things he never told us, he was just part of that silent generation. It really showed me how strong he was and determined and hardworking. And I mean, as an example, in World War II, he did, Paul, do you remember, was it 40 voyages? I don't know, it was somewhere between 20 and 40 voyages. And one of them, for example, was 7 months circumnavigation. And he came out of this, he never had a broken bone. He didn't have any scars. I mean, so many people died in that war, especially a merchant seaman like him. And from everything I have learned, he never got a scratch. It's just amazing to me. And he never complained, never. He just thought he had a wonderful job and he was happy. So it taught me a lot. Does that answer your question?
All right, well, we'll move on to the next one.
Okay, thank you.
That is Colonel Russ Vanderloo. He's currently serving as Joint Director of Plan J5, Alaskan NORAD Region and Alaskan Command at JBIR, Alaska. During his previous assignment, he earned an Army-sponsored doctorate in Arctic and Northern History at UAF. And his doctoral dissertation was investigated the relations between indigenous people and the military in Alaska. So,
All right, we'll jump right into it here. So I'd first like to thank a few individuals who helped in my research. Mary Erlander, who can't be here, Terrence Cole and Ken Pratt, who were both influential. And also Shauna, who's been a great corroborator here in different things regarding to Ivan Petrov. So this presentation is called The Continuing Mystery of Mr. Petrov's History. And it's part 2 because I ran out of time during last year's conference. And I might be actually looking at a part 3 next year. So just to caveat that, I conclude that Mr. Petrov here in his various employment with the US Army, US Treasury and State Departments, alongside his work as customs collector, census agent, freelance writer, linguist, historian, and vagabond, was truly a genius with great linguistic and literary capacity, but he struggled in his physical and mental health and issues throughout his life, and that eventually led to his undoing. So he also struggled with separation from his family. He was gone a lot from them, and this did little to assuage his loneliness and his psyche, as indicated by several letters with his wife, Emma. A hint of instability and loneliness was definitely present throughout his life. However, any serious evaluation of Alaska in the late 19th century must come to terms with the enigma of Ivan Petrov. While wrestling with his complex life and motivations of Alaska's first American-era historian and honorary member of the Alaska Historical Society, as I'll mention at the conclusion. Given his lowly beginnings as an orphan immigrant, Petrov saw an opportunity in Alaska and sought to connect his fortune and career success to the region's anticipated political and resource development. So hitching one's success to Alaska's growing future required being an expert, a position which Petrov rose rapidly to before his demise. Before I continue, I want to put out an all call to all researchers and collaborators here. I'm working on a biography on Mr. Petrov, and I'm looking for someone to help me with that, given my the tempo of my military career. I really believe that we owe this to Alaska history, and I think it needs to be done. So if even no one wants to commit to a book on this, just consider this a call out to the archivist and genealogist. I'm looking for every kernel of information on this man's life, and it's going to be very difficult to track down. For example, I've been unable to find his immigration records or his ship passage from Russia to the United States. So I'm looking for specific records searching in that area. Lydia Black wrote in 1981 that Richard Pierce planned to publish a book on Mr. Petrov, which was tentatively titled The Collected Works of Ivan Petrov. According to Black, in his proposed book, Pierce intended to, quote, present an analysis of all possible fabrications produced by Petrov and produce some insights into the man's motivations. Dick Pierce, as you know, passed away in 2004, and the project remained incomplete. According to Catherine Art, Pierce's daughter, Catherine, was last known to be living in the Oakland-Berkeley area of California, and if she could still be reached, she might have access to her father's papers, including the draft manuscript on Petrov, if it still exists. Terrence Cole tried to find the unfinished manuscript in April of 2005 with the intention of editing it and publishing a memorial volume. Unfortunately, he was not successful in that effort. Any information, therefore, regarding the whereabouts of Richard Pierce's papers would be of great value to Alaska history and further our understanding of Petrov and his sources. Petrov's spouse, Emma, died in 1937 at age 81. And his daughter, Olga, died a year after her mother, Emma, in 1938. That leaves Petrov's last known descendant, his great daughter, Sonny McKibben, who was a book salesman in Los Angeles. And she went missing actually right around the time of both her mother and grandmother's death. So all that to say, if anyone has additional information on Petrov, please do not hesitate to contact me. I'm selling that as an advertisement. Okay, so can you go back a slide?
Oh, sure.
One too far ahead to the map. So here we are in Kenai. Of course, I see Jim carrying the audience here. There's many different spellings of the Dena'ina names that we're surrounded by here on the peninsula. This is how Petrov's linguistic mind heard and recorded them in 1880 in his ethnographic census map. And you'll notice that we might be closer here to the native village of Chernilia than that of Shkipituk. And Jim, you can help me that, but that's where we are there.
That's E2. We slide down, we slide or steep down.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And note that we're, on the south side of the river, and there he records another village as well across the Kotnu River. So on this legend, the number 28 here represents the Kinats or Tinats Kotana of the Tina people. And 18 over here in the green, that's the Chugachinut. So though some of these pronunciations may be somewhat Russianized, it's important to pay attention how Petrov heard them and transcribed these names in 1880, given he was one of the few individuals traveling throughout Alaska at the time who was equally adept in both Russian and English, while possessing a unique propensity for native languages. Now let's go to the three pictures slide. So Petrov's literary input, his far-ranging Alaska travels, his facility with languages, he was fluent in over a dozen European languages along with Alaska natives. And his interaction with the people here during his census enumeration included vast cultural and indigenous word lists, including the Petrov Stafif vocabulary of 1885. One of the most extensive word lists on Dena'ina in the 19th century. Okay, so really excellent work there. Scholars, though, tend to disparage Petrov for his tendency to augment archival sources with insights from his travels and experiences, and in a few instances to fabricate accounts. Three primary examples of Petrov's pretext include fabrication of the journal of Father Juvenal, writing as a fake European correspondent in the 1877 Russo-Turkish War for the San Francisco Chronicle, and then lastly, the altering translations for the U.S. State Department in conjunction with the Bering Sea arbitration. And I'll also talk about his several desertions from the U.S. Army. So in the context of Petrov's outrageous fabrication of Juvenal's journal, Terence Cole wrote once that, quote, Ivan Petrov holds the distinction of probably telling more lies about Alaska than were believed for years than any other person who lived. I would mention that wasn't in an academic journal, and so I'll kind of throw Terence a bone on that one. But I'm gonna sort of walk that statement back a bit because there's a lot to be gained inside of Petrov's writings. So in many cases, his contributions are overshadowed by his duplicitous tendencies. However, given the volume of information that Petrov produced on this remote region during a period when very little information was available, it remains critical not to make the mistake of allowing these fabrications to corrupt Petrov's entire life corpus. For certain places, Petrov's accounts may be all we scholars have to analyze. Indeed, Petrov was both a gifted expositor and a forger who possessed the uncanny ability to tailor his writing to what his boss or his readership wanted to hear. His facility with languages and written word, coupled with his travels and his residence here in Alaska, placed him among the foremost experts on the region during the late 19th century. So, despite his checkered career, Petrov and his unique knowledge, skills, experience, and throughout the region, he does enrich our knowledge of Alaska's diverse past. So, what do we know about his life? Next slide, please. I'm going to run through three quick timelines here. Not every detail here will I show you, but what I'm finding is I know more about Petrov than first meets the eye. I'm trying to trace him from where he was born and orphaned in Russia, both his mother and father dying. I talked about that last year in part one. how he got into languages in Russia before coming over to the United States and enlisting in the Union Army. Did quite a bit of research there to find out he was simultaneously in 2 different regiments under very similar names. That may have had some economic advantages, but he was wounded in action. In fact, both Petrovs were wounded in action. And you'll notice he used, he at least used the name John, which is the Slavic equivalent, or the John is the English equivalent of the Slavic Ivan. So there's some legitimacy here. He was wounded, and I think he mustered out as a corporal, though Bancroft has him as the lieutenant. So I haven't been able to corroborate that piece of information. Then he comes to the West Coast. He travels west. He arrives in Alaska, enlists again, and he may have been at the Alaska transfer ceremony. He may have accompanied Prince Makustov to San Francisco, and then I do know he deserted again. This is his midlife career. Next timeline. You'd advance, please, Rachel. Okay, so this is when I picked up here with Shauna, some of Shauna's research when he was serving at Fort Kenai. He did many trips during this time, which became excellent material for several articles in various papers. So I have different scholars sending me things, say, hey, does this Petrov? It wasn't actually, we don't see an author for this article, and I can usually tell based on his stylistic writing if it was. And one of the recent discoveries was this sketches in Alaska, gold seeking, and then also a dangerous winter voyage up Cook's Inlet. So some great writing here. But it's been augmented to a certain degree from the papers. So he goes back to San Francisco after being discharged, lives there for a while, deserts again. Meanwhile, he's writing for the papers. He gets picked up by Bancroft to help him with some of his historical research in the Bancroft Library. He was finally apprehended and imprisoned, I think, at Alcatraz. There was a military prison there during the 1870s. It may have been Angel Island. Later exonerated, gets married, and he's recommended based on some of the work that he's doing to serve as the Alaska's first census agent in 1880. So that's basically on the tail of doing a lot of research in 78 and 79 in Alaska for Bancroft. He went to a lot of the Russian Orthodox churches, collected a lot of company records. He was really into the archives. So next slide, please, Rachel. So meanwhile, he did have one child with Emma. So he had more responsibilities there as a father and spouse for financial support. Here's those trips I mentioned to Alaska. Then he gets involved in the census, a short hiatus there, writing a newspaper called the Alaskan Appeal. I'll talk about that in a minute. And after the census, this is his major breakthrough. So he has a lot of material. He starts publishing for academic journals at that point. He finally gets executive clemency, so he gets his name cleared, officially discharged from the Army. So that's a good win for him there. And then he goes on kind of an exile here to Kodiak for 5 years, which is interesting. Serves as a customs collector, brings his family out there. We know which house he lived in, and there's some extra reporting that he did while customs collector. So he hides out for a while in Kodiak. Both governors, Kincaid and Swinford, praise him in their annual reports for this most accurate data on Alaska. And then from that, he gets into the 11th census, 1890. He's the head honcho for that. Doesn't do a lot of the field work himself, as in 1880, but he basically arranges that census, covers a few regions by himself. And when he's back in DC, he gets rolled into this Bering Sea arbitration, which I'll allude to towards the end of this. So that becomes his downfall. He gets fired from the Treasury Department as a result. His name gets expunged from the census, which is really horrible. And as a result, scholars don't realize that he did most of the work for that thing in 1890. And then he dies in obscurity 4 years later under still quite a bit of stress. So in next year's presentation, part 3, I'm going to tell you how Henry Elliott exonerated Petrov. Okay, because I know I'm going to run out of time. He exonerates Petrov to a degree in testimony before Congress. So that part is actually very little known, and we'll get to revisit Petrov. So let's advance, Rachel.
It's actually Kayla's time right now.
Okay, well, thank you, team. All right, so I wish most of these scholars were still alive, but unfortunately they're not. So I don't really have many folks to dialogue with on Petrov. Ken Pratt is still doing excellent work and wrote an article a few years back that evaluated his census accuracy on Nunavut Island. But other than that, we have basically these sources. They're primarily in the 60s and 70s, and then scholarship on Petrov died off. And I'm trying to reinvigorate that. So I just show you a brief collage here to some of the more important secondary sources here, without going into a lot of detail. But basically, what the bottom line of all this is that scholars insisted, several of these scholars insisted that we dismiss all sources authored by Petrov, owing to the mistakes that irreparably harm his credibility. Okay. I argue that a more rational approach entails caution here, but a comprehensive approach towards any of these so-called tainted sources, rather than discarding the entire corpus of Petrov's work. So frequently, to understand Petrov, we have to look at both his character and his motivations, which can be somewhat difficult of an endeavor, and also understand this man who often wrote under a nom de plume or pen name, that his life will remain shrouded in mystery. So that's an arduous task. Okay. But as Morgan Sherwood pointed out, Petrov was willing to gather and disseminate a lot of information about Alaska, but he was very mysterious or enigmatic about himself. He was reluctant to divulge anything about himself. Next slide, please. So I'm going to blaze through these real quick, and Shauna's agreed to hold these up. So that's Bancroft's history in 1886, but who wrote that? Ivan Petrov wrote that, or a majority of that was authored by Ivan Petrov. During his travels, he collected the information. He also scoured the archives in DC to come up with that wonderful first American era history. I call it the first because it really, Dahl's Alaska and its resources doesn't really qualify as a history as much as that one does. And then Shauna, I have the other two, which are the census, the 1880 census there, and these are all kind of rare, so she's going to be careful. But the 1880 census, so that's 189 pages. Petrov wrote every single one of those pages. And interestingly, there's a lot of material extracted from that into Bancroft's History of Alaska. So folks don't realize that, but he did. And then that one, that's the 1891. Okay, and that's the one where his name got expunged. And so scholars miss the fact that this is really Petrov's third monument. And he wrote what I figured to be 54% of it, which is actually quite a bit considering how he divided and conquered the state. He wasn't a one-man show in the 1890 census, but he had a lot of help with that. Next slide, please. Okay, and just a quick preview. Here's how he did the 1880 census. He divided it into different districts. On this piece here, so Petrov took very deliberate steps here to establish himself as the first true historian of Alaska. He penned the first narrative history, which is a section in that 1880 census report. And what happened here was a Minnesota press picked up that history, extracted it, and put it into a popular version here, published a few years later. It's a 94-page handbook, and it's a very flattering title, as you can see here. Very exhaustive and extremely special report. You know, the best living expert on the subject, Mr. Petrov. So, though many critics would label him an amateur, as a historian, Petrov was constantly improving his craft, scouring the Russian archives, and also throughout his journeys in Alaska to collect historical information. So one of those pieces, in 1878, Petrov kept a very detailed journal of his travels, which is a historical document in its own right. And this was incorporated into other vignettes in a book called Literary Histories, published by Bancroft. And Bancroft here cites his protege and explains how he sifted through all Alaska's material, translating Russian books, etc. Spent 2 years in Washington, D.C., looking at the records of the Russian American Company. He was also in the Library of Congress, the Archives of the Navy, the Interior and Coast Survey departments, and the Geological and Ethnological bureaus. So this is a true research-oriented historian. And I do want to showcase a few more of his strengths. We'll flip through these slides real quick. Next one, please. So this is his travel route in 1880. Most folks don't realize that he physically traveled, all these distances by himself. You know, this is comparable to almost the Henry Allen expedition in some ways. And look at the detail here, you know, on the Kuskokwim on some of these villages. So really incredible. He gets all the way up here, you know, about midway on the Tanana, gets up to Fort Kenai. Of course, he'd spent quite a bit of time on the Kenai Peninsula during the previous decade. Next slide, please. Okay, and this shows the following year, he came back and did another travel circuit in 1881 with much more time. Look at how he portaged here across to Whittier in this route. Prince William Sound, came into Newcheck, Copper River up to Alagonac, and then all the way out here to Cape Yaktag, where he was actually held hostage by the Tlingit for a short period of time. And there's some great newspaper articles that he wrote on that adventure. But this is to show some of his coverage. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the result of the 1880 census, the topographic version of it. There's other economic, you know, furs, timber, different resources that he illustrates in this series of maps. Next slide. And this is a lesser known map. This is the 1890 census map, which really incorporates a lot of Henry Allen's data of the interior. This is a fantastic map, and I propose the earliest accurate version comprehensively of the state of Alaska here out of the 1890 census. Next slide. Okay, here's an example of the literary appeal or the Alaska appeal. And you can see the purpose here is really to argue for government for the American citizens and the quote temporary inhabitants there. And so he published this for about a year. This was his sort of endeavor to being the editor of his own newspaper, really sponsored by folks in Sitka, boosters in Sitka, and then embossed by the Bancroft Library. So I will keep driving on. I could talk more about this, but it's a fairly significant contribution. Next slide. He was also an artist, and all these watercolors that are in the census, this is from the 1880 census that Shauna held up. These were all done by Petrov, though he doesn't brag about them. He doesn't write his name underneath them. But there are different clues to him producing this artwork. So fantastic, you know, knowing that even though they're exaggerations, this is Petrov here. So he's getting, they're kind of sticking him along through this quagmire swamp, and he's in the center with his hoodie up. Just really kind of fascinating insights here. Next slide, please. And this is during his census taking on the island of Nunavut, where he capsized, and you can see sort of a dramatized version, self-portrait of him almost tipping his kayak. And this was in Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly. Next slide. And just some other capture. He was great at both pen and ink and watercolor. You know, some of these early drawings, he's not a Henry Elliott, but definitely a lot of artistic ability there that goes under-realized. Next slide. This is a black and white watercolor. Next slide. And this one's fantastic in terms of just the detail here. This one is also from the 1880 census. And next slide. Okay, this is on the island of Kodiak. Fantastic watercolor. Next slide. Okay, so here's where I jumped to, you know, so we've seen some of Petrov's strengths. Petrov's biggest failure is really encapsulated in the Bering Sea arbitration. We don't have a lot of time to go into that, but I want to say here, so I plan to cover this next year during the society conference, and really this man on the left exonerates Elliott through this, or Elliott exonerates Petrov. And though I do conclude that Petrov fabricated these documents, there's more to the story than there. Petrov's falsification, you know, was discovered in the nature of Petrov's confession, revealed. And I also discovered his motivations for that. So in short, Petrov did certainly compose false translations for the benefit of the US government in this Bering Sea arbitration, but he was under duress at the time and likely accepted a bribe or promises of future employment. And he was let off scot-free, not brought to trial on this, which is an important point because it would have implicated the Harrison administration. So lots of intrigue, you know, late 19th century politics going on there. Petrov's certainly guilty, but there's a lot more to the story in that. So next slide, please. So you'll have to I just really don't have time to go into some of these sources that I discovered, but I'll save that for next year. Interestingly, Petrov, even though he was guilty of this crime, was permitted to slip quietly away and fade into oblivion without being punished, right? The press and the American people wondered why, as you can see from this collage of newspaper clips. And Petrov himself was found himself in the quagmire of this corrupt administration in the late 19th century. Eliot surmised that Petrov received hush money as he left town. So, you know, you see that there in the whereas Ivan Petrov. But regardless of the title from the capital region, it's very, very doubtful that Petrov was a rogue falsifier in the scandal. What I believe Petrov sought was financial security. That's what he had been seeking his whole life, and the prestige of a stable government position, which he was likely promised with this deal. Petrov's decision follows a very predictable pattern in line with his previous actions. He was always on the edge financially. So he picked up his pen, provided his employer or his readers with exactly what they wanted to hear. And he failed to consider the consequences, which led to the undoing of both his health and his employment with the US government. Next slide, please. So he was expunged. You will not find his name in the census, the 11th census of Alaska, because he was fired from the State Department. And so this whole thing, this stress, hastened his death. And in expunging his name, though, there's one mistake, or maybe it wasn't a mistake, but they left this picture in the 11th census, and it's very prominent in its place there. So, and this is Petrov himself. You know, and the title of the caption underneath this is, you know, Petrov taking the census, and this we figured out was near Kodiak. Okay, all right. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to conclude here. This is one of the few photos we have of Petrov, and honestly, it hasn't been published yet, so I'm pretty excited about the fact that we have this. But basically, you know, so in conclusion, you know, looking back at all the sources, Petrov is a very complex character, complex man, and he falls off the history of Alaska quickly upon his falsification of the Bering Sea. And he's buried 4 years later in an unmarked grave outside of Philadelphia. So I do think it's very important for scholars studying the 19th century to understand Petrov's true identity and his role in this scandal, what his motivations were, and what the political backdrop to that is. If you go to the gravestone slide, Rachel. So there it is. Actually, this is not his gravestone, but he's buried here where these roses are. This is a self-portrait that he sketched of himself for Leslie's newspaper based on that photo I showed you, his death certificate. You know, the sad thing is, so he's listed, all he's listed on his death certificate here is as a proofreader. So he really did die in obscurity. At the time of his death, Olga recalled that her father was engaged in writing a collection of Alaska short stories, with publishing perhaps 8 or 10 in one volume. We know that he translated The Two-Legged Wolf into Russian under the pen name Boris Lanin, which was his mother's maiden name. So truly, you know, a man with a lot of mental baggage, behavioral baggage from his time being orphaned as a child. And my last slide, because I know I'm out of time. What time is it? Yeah. So recent membership here. I did flash this last year, I think, but I just want to point out to all the Historical Society members that they invited him to be an honorary member in 1890. The timing of this is critical because it's 2 years before he got caught up in the Bering Sea arbitration. But his membership still stands.
Yeah, well,
And
he hasn't paid his dues.
Yeah, he just needed to write one more article that's, you know, a well-selling newspaper article. So that's Mr. Ivan Petrov. Thank you for your time. If you know anything more, please reach out to me, and look forward to next year's conference where I'll give you all the details of that scandal and his role.
Yeah, thank you so much.